Some horses are born into greatness. Some are bought for millions and trained by the best hands in the world. But every once in a while, a horse comes along that nobody wants, nobody believes in, and nobody gives a second look. This is the story of one such horse. A grey stallion with scars on his body and fire in his eyes. The world had already written his ending. Trainers walked away from him. Owners gave up on him. Veterinarians shook their heads and said he would never run again, never jump again, never be anything more than a pasture ornament waiting to be forgotten. But fate has a funny way of proving people wrong. And on one cold morning, in front of a crowd that had no idea what they were about to witness, this forgotten grey stallion gathered every broken piece of himself and launched into the air with a leap so powerful, so impossible, that it did not just clear the obstacle in front of him. It cleared every doubt, every rejection, and every cruel word that had ever been spoken about him. This is not a fairy tale. This is the true story of a horse named Sterling Ash, and the leap that changed everything. Nobody in the small town of Harrowfield, Virginia, paid much attention when the grey colt was born on a rainy April night in 2009. The farm where he came into the world was not one of those famous breeding operations with white fences and million-dollar bloodlines. It was a modest place owned by a man named Robert Calloway, a retired schoolteacher who had loved horses his entire life, but never had the money or the connections to play in the big leagues of the horse world. Robert ran a small operation with just 7 mares and 1 aging stallion. He bred horses not for glory or profit, but because he believed every horse deserved a chance to be something. The grey colt arrived just after midnight, slipping into the world on shaky legs while rain hammered the tin roof of the old barn. His mother, a dark bay mare named Evening Song, licked him clean and nudged him to stand. Robert watched from the corner of the stall, a cup of cold coffee in his hand, and smiled. The colt was a light silver grey, almost white in certain light, with dark eyes that seemed to look right through you. Robert named him Sterling Ash, partly because of his colour, and partly because his grandmother had always said that something sterling was something of true worth, even if it did not shine right away. Sterling Ash grew up like most young horses on a small farm. He ran through the fields with the other foals. He learned to eat grass and drink from the creek. He kicked and played and rolled in the mud. But even from the beginning, there was something different about him. He was not the biggest colt in the pasture. He was not the fastest. He did not have the kind of flashy movement that made people stop their cars on the road to stare. What he had was something harder to see, but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. He had heart. When the other foals would shy away from a loud noise or a flapping tarp, Sterling Ash would walk straight toward it. When a thunderstorm rolled through and the other horses ran for the shelter of the trees, Sterling Ash would stand in the open field, ears forward, rain running down his face, as if he was daring the sky to do its worst. Robert noticed this early on. He told his wife Martha one evening over dinner that the grey colt was either the bravest horse he had ever seen or the most stubborn. Martha laughed and said those were probably the same thing. When Sterling Ash turned 3, Robert began his basic training. The colt took to the saddle with surprising ease. He did not buck or fight. He seemed almost eager to learn, as if he had been waiting for someone to finally ask him to do something meaningful. Robert was not a professional trainer. He had learned horsemanship from books and old-timers and decades of quiet patience, but he knew enough to recognize that Sterling Ash had a natural talent for jumping. The colt would approach a fence in the pasture and clear it with so much room to spare that it almost looked like he was flying. His form was not perfect. His technique was rough. But the raw power in his hindquarters and the fearless way he attacked every obstacle told Robert that this horse was special. He began setting up small jumps in the arena behind the barn, cross rails at first, then verticals, then small oxers. Sterling Ash cleared them all without hesitation. He seemed to love the feeling of leaving the ground, of hanging in the air for that one perfect moment before gravity pulled him back down. Word began to spread in the local horse community. A few people came by the farm to watch the grey horse jump. Most of them were polite, but not impressed. They said he was too small. They said his breeding was nothing special. They said his movement was flat, and his conformation was average. One trainer from a nearby show barn told Robert plainly that the horse had a ceiling and it was not very high. Robert listened to all of this and nodded and thanked people for their opinions. But when he was alone with Sterling Ash in the evening, brushing the dust from his silver coat, he would lean close to the horse's ear and whisper that they did not know what they were talking about. Robert believed in the horse. That was enough for now. He entered Sterling Ash in a few local shows during the summer of 2012. They were small events, nothing fancy, held at county fairgrounds with portable fences and uneven footing. Sterling Ash won his first 3 competitions easily. He jumped clean rounds every time and seemed almost bored by the height of the fences. Robert was proud. Martha was proud. The small farm felt like it was on the edge of something big. But life, as it often does, had other plans. In September of that year, during a routine training session at home, Sterling Ash landed awkwardly after a jump and pulled up lame. Robert felt his stomach drop. He knew before the veterinarian even arrived that something was seriously wrong. The diagnosis came 2 days later. Sterling Ash had a significant injury to his left front suspensory ligament. The veterinarian, a kind woman named Dr. Patricia Helm, explained the situation carefully. The ligament was damaged but not completely torn. With rest and proper rehabilitation, there was a chance the horse could recover. But she was honest about the odds. Many horses with this type of injury never return to jumping. Some never return to any kind of athletic work at all. She told Robert to prepare himself for the possibility that Sterling Ash's jumping career might be over before it truly began. Robert stood in the barn that night with his hand on the horse's neck. Sterling Ash stood quietly, his injured leg slightly lifted off the ground, his dark eyes watching Robert's face as if he understood everything. Robert did not cry. He was not that kind of man. But he felt something heavy settle in his chest, a weight that would stay there for a long time. He made a decision right then. He would give this horse every chance to heal. He would not rush him. He would not give up on him. No matter how long it took, no matter what anyone said, Robert Calloway was going to stand by Sterling Ash, because that is what you do when you believe in something. You do not walk away when it gets hard. You stay. The months that followed were the hardest Robert Calloway had ever known as a horseman. Sterling Ash was confined to his stall for the first 12 weeks. No turnout, no walking, no movement beyond the 4 walls of his small world. For a horse that had spent his life running through open fields and soaring over fences, this was a kind of prison. Robert could see it in the horse's eyes every morning when he came to the barn. Sterling Ash would press his face against the stall door and look out at the pasture where the other horses grazed freely. He would let out a low, quiet nicker, not the loud call of a horse demanding attention, but the soft sound of an animal asking a question he could not put into words. Robert would stand there and stroke his face and tell him it was going to be okay. He did not know if that was true, but he said it anyway because sometimes hope is the only medicine that works when everything else has failed. Dr. Patricia Helm came to the farm every 2 weeks to check on Sterling Ash's progress. She would run her hands down his injured leg, feeling for heat and swelling, and then use an ultrasound machine to look at the ligament. The early reports were not encouraging. The damage was healing slowly, more slowly than she had hoped. She adjusted the treatment plan several times. She prescribed anti-inflammatory medications. She recommended cold therapy and careful hand-walking once the initial rest period was over. Robert followed every instruction to the letter. He set alarms on his phone to remind him when to apply ice wraps. He kept a detailed journal of the horse's condition every single day, recording everything from the temperature of the leg to the horse's mood and appetite. Martha sometimes found him asleep in a chair outside the stall at 3 a.m, the journal open on his lap. The hand-walking began in January of 2013. Robert would lead Sterling Ash out of the barn and walk him slowly up and down the driveway, just 10 minutes at first, then 15, then 20. The grey horse moved carefully, placing his injured leg with obvious caution, but he never resisted the walks. In fact, he seemed grateful for them. The fresh air, the sound of birds, the feel of gravel under his hooves instead of stall bedding, these small things seemed to lift his spirits. Robert watched him closely during every step. He learned to read the horse's body language with a new level of attention. A slight head bob meant the leg was hurting. A relaxed neck and forward ears meant he was comfortable. They developed a silent communication during those walks. A partnership built on trust and patience that went deeper than anything they had shared before. Spring came and the hand-walking increased. By April, Sterling Ash was walking for 30 minutes twice a day. By May, Dr. Helm cleared him for turnout in a small paddock. Robert watched nervously from the fence as the grey horse took his first steps into the open air without a lead rope in months. Sterling Ash stood still for a long moment, his head high, his nostrils flaring as he took in the sense of the season. Then he lowered his head and began to graze. He did not run. He did not buck or play. He simply stood in the grass and ate. And Robert felt tears burning in his eyes because that simple, ordinary act felt like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The rehabilitation continued through the summer and fall. Controlled exercise was introduced gradually. First, walking under saddle, then slow trotting, then eventually cantering in carefully measured intervals. Dr. Helm monitored the ligament with regular ultrasounds and reported steady but slow improvement. She cautioned Robert repeatedly not to rush. One wrong move, one moment of too much too soon, and everything they had worked for could be destroyed in an instant. Robert understood. He had become a student of patience in a way he never thought possible. Every day was measured not in progress, but in the absence of setbacks. A good day was a day where nothing went wrong. That was enough. But while Sterling Ash was slowly healing in body, the world outside the farm was moving on. The local horse community had largely forgotten about the little grey horse from Robert Calloway's farm. The trainers who had watched him jump with mild interest had moved on to other prospects. The show circuit continued without him. New horses appeared, won ribbons, and attracted attention. Sterling Ash became a name that people mentioned only in passing, usually followed by a sad shake of the head and a comment about how injuries like that were career-enders. Robert heard these comments at the feed store and at the local tack shop. He heard them at the few shows he attended as a spectator while Sterling Ash recovered at home. He never argued with anyone. He never defended the horse with angry words or bold predictions. He simply smiled and changed the subject and went home to continue the quiet, invisible work of bringing his horse back from the edge. It was during this period that Robert received an offer that tested his resolve. A man named Victor Haynes, who owned a large breeding farm about 2 hours north of Harrowfield, called Robert one afternoon and said he had heard about the grey horse. Victor said he was looking for a companion horse for one of his retired stallions and wondered if Robert would be willing to sell Sterling Ash at a fair price. He said the horse would have a good life, plenty of pasture and good feed and no pressure to perform. He said it with the kind of practiced sympathy that suggested he had made this call many times to many owners of injured horses. Robert listened quietly and then said, "No, thank you." Victor pushed back gently. He said it might be the kindest thing for the horse, to let him live out his days without the stress of training and competition. Robert thanked him again and hung up the phone. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time afterward, staring at his hands. Martha came in and asked who had called. Robert told her. She sat down across from him and took his hand and said nothing because she already knew what his answer had been and why. The winter of 2013 into 2014 was harsh. Snow came early and stayed late. The barn was cold, despite the insulation Robert had added years ago. Sterling Ash grew a thick winter coat that made him look like a fuzzy grey bear. Robert continued the rehabilitation program through the cold months, adjusting the schedule around the weather. On days when the footing was icy and dangerous, they stayed inside. On milder days, they worked in the small indoor arena that Robert had built himself out of salvaged lumber and determination. The arena was nothing fancy. The footing was a mix of sand and wood shavings that Robert raked by hand every day. The walls were rough, and the roof leaked in 2 places. But it was theirs, and it served its purpose. By early spring of 2014, something began to change. Sterling Ash was moving differently. The caution that had marked his steps for over a year was starting to fade. His stride was longer. His head was higher. There was a new energy in his body that Robert recognized from the old days, from the time before the injury, when the horse would prance and dance on the way to the arena, as if he could not wait to jump. Robert felt it in the reins, and in the saddle, and in his own chest. He did not dare say it out loud, not yet, but he allowed himself to think it for the first time in 18 months. Maybe, just maybe. Dr. Helm came for her spring checkup and spent a long time looking at the ultrasound images. She compared them to the images from the initial injury. She looked at Robert and said the ligament had healed remarkably well. She said the fiber pattern was dense and strong. She said that she had honestly not expected this level of recovery, and that Sterling Ash was one of the lucky ones. Then she paused and asked Robert what he wanted to do. Robert did not hesitate. He said he wanted to jump again. Dr. Helm studied his face for a moment, and then nodded slowly. She said they would need to start small and build up gradually, and that she wanted to see the horse every month. She said there were no guarantees, and that the risk of re-injury was real. Robert said he understood. He said that Sterling Ash deserved the chance to do what he was born to do. And standing there in that imperfect barn on that ordinary spring morning, the decision was made. The grey horse would jump again. The road back was not over, but the hardest part was behind them. Or so Robert thought, because what was coming next would test both of them in ways that no injury ever could. Robert began reintroducing jumps in May of 2014 with the kind of care a surgeon would use with a scalpel. He started with ground poles, simple wooden rails laid flat on the arena floor. Sterling Ash walked over them, then trotted, then cantered, and each time Robert watched the horse's legs with a concentration so intense that Martha said he looked like a man trying to read a book, written in a language he barely understood. But Robert was learning this language fluently. He could feel through the saddle whether the horse was sound, whether the stride was even, whether there was any hesitation in the takeoff or landing. For weeks it was just ground poles, then small cross rails, barely a foot off the ground. Sterling Ash popped over them like they were cracks in a sidewalk, his ears pricked forward, his neck arched, his whole body seemed to say, finally. By midsummer, the jumps had grown to 2 feet, then 2.5, then 3. Sterling Ash was clearing them with room to spare, his old power returning to his hindquarters like a river refilling after a drought. Robert was careful not to push too hard or too fast, but he could not deny what he was seeing. The horse was not just coming back. He was coming back better. Something about the long months of recovery, the patient rebuilding of muscle and tendon and bone, had given Sterling Ash a foundation he had never had before. His body was stronger, his balance was sharper, and his desire to jump was burning brighter than ever, as if the time away from the sport had only deepened his hunger for it. Robert entered Sterling Ash in a small local show in August of 2014. It was a low-key event at a farm about 20 minutes from Harrowfield. The fences were modest, nothing higher than 3 feet 6 inches. Robert trailered the horse over early in the morning and unloaded him in the parking area. Sterling Ash stepped off the trailer and looked around at the showgrounds with his ears forward and his nostrils wide. He let out a long, deep breath and then stamped his front foot on the ground as if to say he remembered this. He remembered all of it. Robert tacked him up and warmed up in the practice ring. A few people recognized the grey horse and stopped to watch. One woman, a trainer Robert knew slightly, walked over and asked if that was the horse that had been injured. Robert said yes. She looked at Sterling Ash jumping a warm-up fence and shook her head slowly and said, "Well, would you look at that?" The competition was not dramatic. Sterling Ash jumped a clean round in his division and won first place. He did it easily, almost casually, as if the fences were an afterthought. Robert collected the blue ribbon and tucked it into his jacket pocket and drove home with the windows down and the radio playing old country songs. He did not celebrate loudly. That was not his way. But when he got home and turned Sterling Ash out in the pasture and watched him roll in the evening grass, he allowed himself a moment of pure, unguarded happiness. They had done it, against the odds and against the opinions of everyone who had said this day would never come. They had done it. Over the next several months, Robert campaigned Sterling Ash at progressively larger shows. They moved from local events to regional competitions, gradually increasing the height and difficulty of the courses. The gray horse responded to every challenge with the same fearless attitude he had shown as a young colt. He cleared fence after fence, round after round, with a consistency that began to attract serious attention. People in the show-jumping community started talking about the gray horse from Virginia. They told the story of his injury and his comeback, and the story grew with each telling, becoming something larger than just a horse and his owner. It became a story about resilience and belief, and the stubborn refusal to accept a bad ending. But along with the attention came scrutiny. As Robert and Sterling Ash moved into higher levels of competition, they entered a world that operated by different rules. The show-jumping circuit at the regional and national level was dominated by wealthy owners, professional riders, and horses that cost more than most people's houses. Robert was a retired schoolteacher riding a horse with no pedigree and no famous trainer. He did not have a team of grooms or a custom-built horse trailer or a wardrobe of expensive show clothes. He had a 20-year-old truck, a second-hand saddle, and a quiet determination that some people found admirable and others found annoying. There were whispers at the bigger shows. People said he was in over his head. People said the gray horse was a fluke, a local champion who would crumble when the fences got truly big. People said Robert should enjoy what he had accomplished and stop before he embarrassed himself. Robert heard the whispers, but did not let them change his course. He had learned something during the long months of Sterling Ash's recovery, a lesson that went beyond horsemanship. He had learned that the opinions of others are just noise. They can be loud and persistent and sometimes painful, but they are still just noise. The only voice that mattered was the one inside his own chest, and that voice said, "Keep going." Sterling Ash seemed to share this philosophy. The horse was not bothered by the fancy showgrounds or the expensive competition. He walked into strange arenas with the same steady confidence he had shown walking through thunderstorms as a young colt. He looked at towering jump courses with those dark, fearless eyes and attacked them with everything he had. In the spring of 2015, Robert made a decision that surprised even Martha. He entered Sterling Ash in a qualifying competition for one of the most prestigious show-jumping events on the East Coast. The entry fee alone was more than Robert spent on groceries in a month. The competition would feature some of the best horses and riders in the country. The fences would be higher and more technical than anything Sterling Ash had ever faced. It was, by any reasonable measure, a ridiculous gamble. But Robert had stopped being reasonable about a year ago. He had crossed some invisible line where logic gave way to faith, and he was not going back. They arrived at the qualifier the night before the competition. The venue was a sprawling equestrian center with manicured grounds and gleaming white fences, and a main arena that looked like a cathedral dedicated to the sport of show jumping. Robert unloaded Sterling Ash and led him to the temporary stabling area. The grey horse walked past rows of horses that were worth small fortunes. He passed grooms in matching uniforms and riders in custom boots, and trainers barking instructions into cell phones. He walked through all of it without flinching, his silver coat catching the last light of the evening sun, his hooves clicking steadily on the concrete aisle. Robert put him in his stall and hung a water bucket and filled a hay net and stood there for a moment looking at his horse. Sterling Ash looked back at him and then dropped his head into the hay and began eating as if this was the most normal thing in the world. The morning of the qualifier dawned grey and cool. Robert was up before the sun, unable to sleep. He walked to the barn and found Sterling Ash already awake, standing at the front of his stall with his ears forward. Robert fed him and groomed him and tacked him up with the same routine they had followed 1,000 times before. Routine was everything. It was the anchor that kept both of them calm when the world around them was screaming that they did not belong here. They warmed up in the practice ring alongside riders who had competed in Nations Cups and Grand Prix events. Robert kept his focus on his horse and ignored everything else. Sterling Ash moved beautifully, his stride long and powerful, his transitions smooth and willing. When they popped over a few practice fences, Robert felt that familiar surge of power beneath him and knew that the horse was ready. Their round was scheduled for late morning. Robert walked the course on foot beforehand, memorizing every turn and every distance and every approach angle. The course was demanding. 13 fences set at heights and widths that Sterling Ash had never attempted in competition. There were combinations that required precise striding and rollback turns that demanded agility and trust between horse and rider. Robert studied each fence and made his plan, and then walked back to the barn to get his horse. As he led Sterling Ash toward the arena, a man stopped him. It was Victor Haynes, the same man who had called months ago offering to buy the horse as a companion animal. Victor looked at the grey stallion, and then at Robert, and said he almost did not recognize him. He said the horse looked incredible. Robert thanked him and kept walking. There was nothing more to say. The fences would speak for themselves. The announcer called their names over the loudspeaker, and Robert felt his heart kick against his ribs like a trapped animal. He gathered his reins and pointed Sterling Ash toward the entrance of the arena. The grey horse walked through the gate and into the ring with his head high and his eyes sharp. The arena was enormous compared to anything they had competed in before. The stands held a few hundred spectators, not a massive crowd, but enough to create a low hum of conversation that filled the air like static. The jump course stretched out before them, a maze of colourful rails and white standards and decorative flower boxes that made the fences look both beautiful and intimidating. Robert took a deep breath and squeezed his legs, and Sterling Ash broke into a canter. The first fence came up fast. It was a vertical, the rails set at a height that would have seemed impossible just 2 years ago. Sterling Ash locked onto it with those fearless eyes and drove forward with his hind legs. Robert felt the horse's body coil like a spring beneath him and then release. They were airborne. The rails passed beneath them with inches to spare, and they landed clean on the other side. The crowd gave a polite murmur of approval. Robert did not hear it. He was already looking at the second fence. They cleared the second and third fences without incident. The fourth was a wide oxer that required a bold, forward ride. Robert asked Sterling Ash for more speed, and the horse responded instantly, lengthening his stride and powering toward the jump with a determination that Robert could feel in every fibre of the horse's body. They flew over it. The fifth fence, the sixth, the seventh. Each one fell behind them as Sterling Ash moved through the course with a rhythm and confidence that bordered on artistry. He was not just jumping fences, he was performing. His ears were forward, his body was electric, and his movement had a grace that contradicted everything the experts had ever said about his breeding and his conformation. The eighth fence was a combination, 2 jumps set close together, that required the horse to land from the first and immediately take off for the second. This was where technical skill mattered more than raw power. Robert steadied Sterling Ash on the approach, asking him to shorten his stride and wait for the right distance. The horse listened. He listened with an obedience and trust that brought tears to Robert's eyes, even in the middle of competition. They cleared the first element of the combination, and Sterling Ash adjusted his stride in the 1 stride gap between the fences with a precision that would have impressed any Grand Prix rider. The second element fell away behind them. Clean. Fences 9, 10, and 11 came and went in a blur of focused intensity. Robert's world had narrowed to a tunnel that contained only his horse and the next obstacle. Everything else had disappeared. The crowd, the judges, the other competitors watching from the rail, all of it was gone. There was only Sterling Ash beneath him, and the sound of hooves on sand and the rush of wind as they left the ground again and again. Robert had never experienced anything like this. It was beyond riding. It was something closer to flying. It was as if the horse had taken him somewhere he had never been, a place where doubt did not exist and everything was possible. Fence 12 was a triple bar, a spread fence with rails ascending in height from front to back. It was one of the most imposing obstacles on the course, and Robert could see that it had caught out several riders before him. As they turned toward it, Robert felt Sterling Ash's stride falter for just a fraction of a second. It was barely noticeable, a slight hesitation that lasted less than a heartbeat. But Robert felt it. His hands tightened on the reins and his legs pressed harder against the horse's sides. He leaned forward and whispered the word he had been whispering in the barn for 2 years. "Come on!" Sterling Ash surged forward. Whatever had caused that moment of hesitation was gone, replaced by a wave of raw power that launched them over the triple bar with room to spare. The crowd gasped. Even the jaded spectators who had seen thousands of rounds could not help reacting to the sheer athleticism of the jump. In 1 fence left. The final obstacle was a tall vertical placed at the far end of the arena with a sharp turn leading into it. It was a test of both courage and control. A horse that was tired or uncertain would struggle with the approach. Robert swung Sterling Ash around the turn and pointed him at the last fence and let him go. The grey horse pinned his ears flat against his head, not in anger, but in concentration, and drove toward the vertical with everything he had left. His takeoff was perfect. His arc over the fence was clean and high and strong. His landing was balanced and sure. The buzzer sounded. Clear round. 0 faults. Robert pulled Sterling Ash to a walk and reached down to pat the horse's neck with both hands. The grey coat was dark with sweat, and the horse's sides were heaving with effort, but his head was still high and his ears were still forward. He knew what he had done. Horses always know. The crowd applauded, and Robert felt the sound wash over him like warm water. He rode out of the arena and dismounted and pressed his face against Sterling Ash's neck and stood there for a long time, just breathing, just feeling the heat of the horse's body against his skin and the hammer of the horse's heart beating so close to his own. The results were posted an hour later. Sterling Ash had finished 4th overall in a field of 32 horses. He had not won the class. He had not even made the podium. But he had jumped a clear round against some of the best horses in the region, horses that cost 10 times what Robert had spent on Sterling Ash's entire life. The qualifying competition required the top 8 finishers to advance, and Sterling Ash's name was on that list. They were going to the championship. Robert read the results sheet 3 times to make sure he was not making a mistake. He was not. His grey horse, the one that nobody wanted, the one that everyone said was finished, had qualified for the most prestigious show-jumping event on the East Coast. The drive home that evening was quiet. Sterling Ash rode in the trailer behind the old truck, and Robert drove with the windows down and the radio off. He did not need music. His mind was full of replaying every fence, every stride, every moment of the round. He thought about all the mornings of hand-walking in the cold. He thought about the ice wraps and the vet visits and the journal entries and the sleepless nights in the chair outside the stall. He thought about the phone call from Victor Haynes and the trainers who had said the horse was nothing special, and the diagnosis that had nearly ended everything. He thought about Martha, who had never once told him to give up. He thought about Sterling Ash, standing in a thunderstorm as a young colt, ears forward, daring the sky. And he thought about the championship that was waiting for them 6 weeks from now, in a place where nobody would expect them, and where everything they had been through would either matter or it would not. When he got home, Robert unloaded Sterling Ash and turned him out in the pasture. The horse walked to the center of the field and stood there in the moonlight, his silver coat glowing like something out of a painting. Martha came out of the house and stood beside Robert at the fence. She took his hand. She asked him if he was scared about the championship. Robert thought about it for a moment and then said no. He said he had been scared when the veterinarian told him the horse might never jump again. He said he had been scared during the long winter when healing seemed impossibly slow. He said he had been scared every single day of the rehabilitation when one wrong step could have ruined everything. But he was not scared anymore. Fear was something that belonged to the past now. What lay ahead was not something to be afraid of. It was something to be grateful for. They had earned this, both of them. The retired school teacher and the grey horse that nobody wanted. They had earned every single step of the journey that had brought them here, and whatever happened at the championship, that could never be taken away. The 6 weeks between the qualifier and the championship passed faster than Robert had expected. He kept Sterling Ash's training moderate and focused, sharpening the horse's fitness without overworking him. Dr. Helm came for a final checkup 2 weeks before the event and pronounced the horse sound and healthy. She looked at Robert with an expression that mixed professional caution with genuine admiration and told him to go out there and show them what this horse could do. Robert thanked her and shook her hand and did not tell her that his stomach had been in knots for 3 days straight. Some fears you just carry with you. The championship was held at Willow Creek Grand Equestrian Center in Maryland, a venue that Robert had only ever seen in photographs in horse magazines. The facility was stunning. Rolling green hills surrounded a massive outdoor arena with permanent grandstands that could seat 2,000 people. The stabling area was immaculate, with wide aisles and rubber flooring and brass fixtures on every stall door. There were banners and sponsors and television cameras, and an energy in the air that felt completely different from anything Robert had experienced before. This was the big time. This was where champions were made, and legends were born, and dreams either survived or shattered into pieces too small to ever put back together. Robert and Sterling Ash arrived 2 days before competition. They settled into their assigned stall, which was nicer than some apartments Robert had lived in during his 20s. The grey horse seemed unfazed by the grandeur of his surroundings. He ate his hay and drank his water and watched the activity in the barn aisle with calm, intelligent eyes. Robert walked the grounds and studied the arena and tried to quiet the voice in his head that kept telling him he did not belong here. He told himself that voice was wrong. He told himself that he and Sterling Ash had earned their place. He told himself this so many times that he almost believed it. The competition was structured over 2 days. The first day was a speed round that would narrow the field and set the order for the second day's grand final. The course was technical and fast, with tight turns and careful distances that rewarded agility and quick thinking. Robert walked it 3 times, memorizing every detail, every stride count, every approach angle. He knew that Sterling Ash was not the fastest horse in the field, but the grey horse was smart and brave, and they had something that many of the flashy, expensive horses lacked. They had a partnership forged in hardship. They had a trust that had been built during the darkest days of recovery, when all they had was each other, and the stubborn belief that tomorrow would be better than today. The speed round went well. Sterling Ash jumped clean and fast, moving through the course with an efficiency that came from months of careful preparation. He was not the quickest horse that day, but he was one of the cleanest. And when the results were posted, he had finished 8th out of 40 entries. He was through to the grand final. Robert allowed himself a small smile. Martha, who had made the trip to watch, wrapped her arms around him and told him she was proud. Robert said he was proud too, but the real test was tomorrow. The morning of the grand final arrived with a sky full of clouds and a wind that carried the smell of rain. The grandstands were full. People had come from across the eastern seaboard to watch the best horses and riders compete for the championship title. Television cameras were positioned around the arena to broadcast the event to viewers across the country. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Robert tacked up Sterling Ash with steady hands that did not shake, though he would later admit to Martha that his knees were not as cooperative. The grey horse stood perfectly still during the grooming and saddling, his eyes fixed on the arena in the distance, his body vibrating with a quiet energy that Robert could feel through the brush in his hand. He knew, Robert thought. The horse knew that today was different. Today was the day that everything had been leading to. The course for the grand final was the most challenging set of fences Robert had ever seen in person. 14 obstacles, set at heights and widths, that tested the absolute limits of horse and rider. There were combinations and related distances and bending lines, and a final fence that stood alone at the far end of the arena. A massive vertical, with heavy wooden rails and white standards that seemed to touch the sky. The course designer had built a test that would separate the good from the great, and Robert knew as he walked it that morning that several of those fences were higher than anything Sterling Ash had ever jumped in competition. He also knew that it did not matter. They had not come this far to be careful. They had come this far to be brave. Sterling Ash entered the arena for the grand final in the middle of the order. The first 7 rounds had produced only 2 clear efforts, which told Robert everything he needed to know about the difficulty of the course. The crowd was buzzing with the drama of it all. When the announcer called their names and briefly mentioned the story of the grey horse's injury and comeback, a murmur went through the stands. People leaned forward in their seats. Cameras turned toward the entrance gate. Robert gathered his reins and squeezed his legs, and Sterling Ash stepped into the arena. The first half of the course unfolded like a dream Robert had been having for 2 years. Sterling Ash jumped the first 7 fences with a power and precision that silenced the skeptics in the crowd. Each takeoff was timed perfectly. Each landing was balanced and controlled. The horse moved through combinations with the intelligence of an animal that understood the geometry of the course, that could calculate distances and adjust his stride in real time without being told. Robert rode with quiet hands and soft legs, guiding more than commanding, trusting his horse to do what he had always done best. By the 8th fence, the crowd was leaning forward. By the 10th fence, they were holding their breath. Fences 11 and 12 came and went cleanly, and Robert felt his heart pounding so hard that he thought the horse could probably feel it through the saddle. 2 fences left. Fence 13 was a wide oxer on a bending approach that required a bold ride and perfect timing. Robert asked Sterling Ash to move forward, and the grey horse responded with a surge of power that carried them over the oxer, with daylight between his hooves and the rails. The crowd erupted. But Robert did not hear them because he was already looking at the last fence, the big, vertical, the one that had haunted him since he first walked the course that morning. The turn to the final fence was tight, and Sterling Ash had to collect himself quickly, shortening his stride and rebalancing his weight in just a few strides. Robert sat deep in the saddle and waited. He did not rush. He did not panic. He felt Sterling Ash gather himself beneath him, felt the muscles in the horse's back and hindquarters tighten like cables being wound, felt the rhythm of the canter slow and deepen, as the horse measured the distance with an instinct that no trainer could teach. 3 strides out, 2 strides out, 1 stride out. Sterling Ash left the ground with a leap that would be talked about for years afterward. It was not just a jump. It was an explosion of power and will, and everything the grey horse had been carrying inside him since the day he was born on a rainy night in a modest barn in Virginia. He rose into the air with his knees tucked tight against his chest, and his neck stretched forward, and his body forming a perfect arc over the highest fence he had ever faced. Time seemed to stop. Robert felt the world go silent around him. There was no crowd, no arena, no cameras, no judges. There was only the grey horse beneath him and the sky above him and the impossible, beautiful, breathtaking feeling of being airborne. They landed clean. The rail did not move. The buzzer sounded. Clear round! The crowd rose to their feet, and the sound that followed was something Robert Calloway would remember for the rest of his life. It was not just applause. It was a roar. It was 2,000 people who had just watched something they would tell their children about. Robert dropped his reins and threw his arms around Sterling Ash's neck, and the tears he had been holding back for 2 years finally came. Sterling Ash finished the championship in 3rd place overall. He did not win the title. A horse that cost more than Robert's farm took 1st place, ridden by a professional with decades of international experience. But the grey horse from Harrowfield, Virginia, the one that nobody wanted and nobody believed in, had jumped the only clear round in the grand final. He had cleared every fence, including the massive final vertical that had defeated horse after horse before him, and he had done it with a retired schoolteacher in the saddle and scars on his leg and a heart the size of the sky. In the weeks that followed, the story of Sterling Ash spread beyond the show-jumping world. A video of his final round at the championship was posted on social media and viewed millions of times. People who had never watched a horse jump in their lives shared the clip and wrote comments about how it made them cry. News outlets picked up the story. A reporter from a national magazine drove to Harrowfield and spent 3 days at the farm, interviewing Robert and photographing Sterling Ash in his pasture. The article that was published carried the headline that would follow the grey horse for the rest of his life. They said he was finished. Robert read the article at the kitchen table while Martha made breakfast. He folded the magazine closed and looked out the window to where Sterling Ash was grazing in the morning light. The horse raised his head and looked back at him through the glass, and Robert could have sworn the old grey stallion was smiling. He had proven them all wrong, not with anger or defiance or any desire for revenge. He had done it the only way he knew how, one honest leap at a time.